Hey there. Tonight, we're diving into something deceptively simple and sneakily bizarre. Sleep, not your sleep, not mine, but the sleep of people who lived in times when mattresses were made of hay. Pillows were optional, and nighttime was more about demons and discipline than dreams. But before you settle in, maybe with your favourite blanket, a warm drink, or the existential dread of tomorrow, take a second to like the video and subscribe. If you actually enjoy falling asleep to historical oddities told in this exact voice, and I'd love to know, where are you watching from? And what time is it for you right now? Maybe it's just after dinner. Maybe it's so late the birds have started again. Whatever the hour, I'm glad you're here. Let's begin with a question. What happens when sleep isn't a luxury, but an order? You might think sleep is something that happens to you when you're ready, when you're tired, when the Netflix episode ends. But for much of human history, sleep wasn't a matter of preference. It was a duty, a discipline, something you had to perform, and perform it now or take, for instance, the soldier, not the romantic, sword-flashing type, the exhausted one, covered in sweat, mosquito bites, half-eaten bread tucked into his belt, in a trench and in a forest, on a hill he doesn't remember the name of. He didn't sleep when he wanted to. He slept when someone told him to. Right now, 5 minutes. Close your eyes. Don't think. Just collapse. Command sleep. That's what it was. If you didn't master it, you'd be dead. One eye open, weapon nearby. Dream fast, dream hard, dream nothing. Ideally, because if your commanding officer found you sleeping during your watch, you weren't scolded, you were hanged. Not exactly a peaceful lullaby. And yet, this wasn't unique to soldiers. Monks, too, had to sleep on command, except instead of enemies with arrows, they faced bells. Bells at 2 a.m., 3:15, 4:30. Time to pray. Time to chant. Time to stop dreaming and remember God was always watching, especially when you were horizontal. Sleep for monks wasn't a right. It was a temporary release, always interrupted. And if you nodded off during matins, the early morning prayer that nobody was truly awake for you, might get assigned to wash the chamber pots as a gentle reminder that sloth was still a sin, even at 3 a.m. But the royal world wasn't much better. Kings and queens didn't sleep like you might imagine draped in silk, lulled to sleep by harpists and lavender-scented breezes. They were often surrounded by courtiers, physicians, advisors, and in some cases, people who just liked to watch them sleep. Officially, of course, for health reasons, or politics, or because royalty wasn't allowed to be left alone, even dreams. Louis XIV, the Sun King of France, had a full team present for his waking and sleeping rituals. Going to bed was a public ceremony. A small crowd gathered in his chamber to watch him be tucked in. One nobleman would place the royal nightshirt. Another handed the candle. A third announced, solemnly, that it was now time for His Majesty to close his eyes. It was bedtime, but with choreography, and while you might think that sounds indulgent, it was the opposite. Louis didn't get to choose when to sleep. Court dictated it. Etiquette did. If the Duke of so-and-so was still watching, you couldn't yawn. If the Queen hadn't left yet, you couldn't roll over. You lay there, perfectly still, eyes shut, pretending that the heavy velvet curtain of responsibility didn't itch as much as the sheets. Meanwhile, in ancient Sparta, boys were trained to sleep like warriors, which is to say barely sleep at all. They were given minimal bedding, sometimes no bedding, a reed mat if they were lucky. They slept in communal halls, under the stern eye of older soldiers. If they twitched, snored, or talked in their sleep, they could be punished. Why? Because discipline didn't stop when your eyes closed. A true Spartan boy could fall asleep in silence as to remain motionless through the night, and rise at the first sound of command. Sleep wasn't indulgence. It was a test of control, of obedience, of muscle memory in the dark. Fast forward to the 20th century, not exactly. Ancient history and military training still includes sleep deprivation as a form of conditioning. New recruits are taught how to fall asleep instantly, wherever possible, standing, sitting, leaning against a wall, or with half a sandwich still in hand. Close your eyes, that's your window. sleep now or regret it later. In fact, during World War II, American soldiers were taught a specific method: tense every muscle in your body, then release them slowly, starting from the face down to the toes. Clear your mind. Imagine you're in a canoe, drifting on a calm lake, no sound, no threat, no time. Within 6 weeks of practice, they were told you'd be able to fall asleep in under 2 minutes, even with gunfire in the distance, because gunfire was part of the background music. But sleep on command wasn't reserved for warriors and saints. Athletes, too, were trained in it. Soviet gymnasts, particularly in the mid-20th century, were instructed to take micro-naps between training sessions, lie down, 12 minutes, no dreams, just neural reset, then back to the beam, back to the bars, because rest was a tool, not a treat. Even factory workers in the early Industrial Revolution were told when to sleep and, more importantly, when not to. If your shift started at 2 tough. If your housing was crammed with 7 other workers and one of them snored like a mule with bronchitis, tough. You found a way to rest, or you collapsed at your post and someone else got your shift. Sleep had to be wrangled, coerced, managed, like livestock. Which brings us to the strangest part: people throughout history have blamed themselves, not the world, for not sleeping well. Your medieval monk didn't say, "It's the bells that woke me." He said, "I lack devotion." The soldier didn't complain that he couldn't sleep on the muddy ground. He said, "I must learn better discipline." The royal didn't say, "I need privacy." He said, "My honour requires composure." Everyone was expected to sleep well in completely unreasonable conditions, and if you couldn't, well, clearly something was wrong with you. So tonight, if you find yourself tossing and turning, annoyed by the hum of your fridge or the glow of your phone, just know you're not failing, you're adapting, you're reclaiming something that used to belong to soldiers, monks, kings, and gymnasts. The radical idea that sleep might come when you're ready, not when the bell rings. You probably prefer to sleep in a bed. Maybe it's not perfect, a little soft, a little squeaky, maybe missing one pillow, but at the very least, it's not carved into the wall of a tomb. Throughout history, however, some people chose to sleep next to the dead, not because they ran out of space, not because they were trapped, but because they believed the dead were calm, that their silence could be borrowed, that sleeping among bones brought you closer to truth, or eternity, or something no one really understood but whispered about in candlelight. Some of the earliest examples come from ancient Anatolia, where skeletons were buried in the floors of homes, not under the floorboards, in the floor. You could lie down to sleep and know, without doubt, that Auntie was 6 inches beneath you, watching over you, or, depending on the family, judging you. In Roman times, the idea of sleeping near the dead took on a ceremonial twist. Certain sects believed tombs were places of revelation, and by lying among the sarcophagi, one might receive visions, messages, or dreams from ancestors. These weren't horrifying experiences, they were aspirational. A night in the catacombs wasn't seen as morbid, it was a kind of divine slumber party. Of course, it helped that the dead couldn't complain about your snoring. Centuries later, early Christian ascetics, the kind of people who thought regular discomfort was the fastest route to holiness, took this even further. Some would retreat into ancient burial caves to sleep, not for an hour, for years. These weren't graves they stumbled into. These were chosen dwellings, places where silence was absolute and the soul might rise, if the body stayed still long enough. One monk in Syria reportedly lived and slept for decades in a stone tomb that had once held a saint, not a saint's shrine, a literal stone box. He carved out space, laid down straw, and called it home. Visitors came to ask for advice or blessings, standing outside while the man inside whispered between cracks in the lid. He rarely left, he barely ate, but he claimed he slept deeply, with the bones as company. Why would anyone do this? Because the living were loud and messy and full of temptation. The dead, on the other hand, didn't gossip, didn't distract, didn't smell too badly after a few years. And so, Grave sleeping became a kind of sacred silence, a long exhale beneath layers of rock and time. But not all these sleep habits were so holy. In 17th century Bohemia, a secretive sect known as the Quiet Brotherhood believed that dreams were messages from the netherworld, and that the only way to tune into the right frequency was to sleep beneath a freshly filled grave. Not on the grave. Beneath it, members dug narrow burrows beside the burial pits, lined them with cloth, and crawled in to sleep through the night, sometimes 2 nights, sometimes more. They believed the weight of the earth above them filtered out false visions. If they dreamed under the dead, the message must be true. Not everyone survived. Some suffocated, some were buried a little too hastily, but those who emerged claimed to have seen the future or their ancestors or God himself. Their neighbours mostly saw lunacy, but the idea of underground sleep stuck around, in parts of Eastern Europe. It became briefly fashionable for aristocrats to build dream crypts luxurious, furnished rooms below family tombs, complete with cots, incense burners, and walls lined with polished skulls. You'd spend a weekend among the remains, sipping wine, writing poetry, and waiting for the dead to whisper wisdom into your subconscious. It was part séance, part slumber party, part very expensive therapy. Even in 19th century Britain, sleep among the dead had a resurgence not from belief, but from urban necessity. Graveyards were so overfilled that some pauper houses and infirmaries built dormitories adjacent to crypts or cremation vaults. You might share a wall with 30 caskets, or a ventilation shaft with ashes. It wasn't spiritual, it was rent control. And yet, some grew to like it. They said it was quiet, no foot traffic, no shouting neighbours, just the occasional thump of a coffin being repositioned. And maybe the whisper of something brushing against the other side of the wall, which, naturally, you pretended not to hear. But in every age, there were always those who craved the silence of the dead, who believed that real rest couldn't be found above ground, with all the noise and breath and motion of the living. The earth was still. The tombs were undemanding. And isn't that the dream, to sleep without interruption, without conversation, without anyone asking what time you're waking up? Even today, remnants of this strange tradition remain. Meditation retreats in ancient crypts, sleep studies in controlled isolation chambers designed to simulate burial silence, luxury spas that advertise stone cocoon experiences complete with limestone walls, total darkness, and ambient hums pitched just low enough to sound like the underworld. We've sanitized the aesthetic. We no longer crawl into damp pits next to corpses, but the instinct is the same. We want silence, depth, detachment, a space where the world is muffled and no one expects us to reply. Room is too loud, bright, or too full of thoughts. Maybe imagine yourself in an underground chamber. Stone walls, dirt ceiling, breathless air, and no one, absolutely no one, asking what your plan is for the morning. Have you ever tried to fall asleep on a moving bus? You know how hard it is to relax when the floor won't stop shifting beneath you. Now imagine that, but you're on a wooden ship in the middle of the Atlantic. The floor creaks, the ceiling leaks, the walls are ropes, and the only thing you have to sleep on is also a rope. Welcome to the life of a sailor. For centuries, seafarers have had to sleep in the least sleep-friendly environments imaginable: rocking floors, dripping ceilings, shouting crewmates, howling wind, the occasional cannon blast, and they still manage to snore through it. Because when your shift ends at 3 a.m. and the next one starts at 6, your options are few. You sleep when you can, where you can, how you can. Let's begin with the classic, the hammock. To the uninitiated, a hammock might seem like a luxury, a cozy, swinging nest, but on a ship, it's survival gear. Sailors discovered early on that hammocks were the only bedding that made sense. Why? Because they moved with the ship. While the deck tilted and swayed, the hammock floated, absorbing the motion rather than resisting it. If you tried to sleep on a wooden bunk during rough seas, you'd roll out, slam your head, and wake up with splinters in places you didn't know had wood-to-skin contact. The hammock, meanwhile, cradled you like a suspiciously damp cocoon. But sleeping in one wasn't easy. First, you had to get in without flipping. A sailor learned to swing one leg in, lean with the sway, and slide their body into place like threading a needle with meat. Then that you had to stay centered. Too far left, you'd roll out. Too far right, same fate, too much movement, and you would set the entire row of hammocks swinging like a sad human Newton's cradle. Privacy didn't exist, neither did quiet. Hammocks were often strung shoulder to shoulder, chest level, above barrels, beside crates, under beams. Someone's foot might hang directly above your knee, someone's breath might warm your ear. If you were unlucky, someone's parrot might sleep beside you and it didn't snore, it screamed. The smell. A mixture of walt, sweat, mildew, and that peculiar brand of damp wood that never quite dries. And yet, sailors slept. They slept through storms, through shouts, through rats crawling overhead and underfoot, through ships pitching at 30 degrees, through the creak of ropes and the slam of hatches, because they had to. Some sailors preferred to sleep on deck when the weather allowed. The open air was a rare gift. Fewer bodies, fewer smells, just the stars and the wind, and the comforting knowledge that if the ship lurched too hard, you might simply roll into the ocean, but at least it was peaceful. In particularly cramped ships, slave ships, prison hulks, overburdened war vessels, hammocks weren't an option, so sailors slept on coils of rope, curled like cats, or leaned upright in corners, or dozed on top of barrels, legs dangling, balance held by nothing but desperation and an instinct for not dying. In some cases, hammocks weren't even tied to beams, they were tied to other hammocks. A chain of sleep, suspended in the air like a bizarre trapeze act. If the top sailor shifted too hard, the whole system swayed, and someone, somewhere, ended up on the floor. But the weirdest part wasn't the setup, it was the sleep itself. Sailors trained themselves to nap in bursts, 20 minutes here, 45 minutes there. No REM, no dreams, just blackouts between bells. Some could fall asleep standing, leaning against a mast, eyes closed, hands gripping a rope. Others learned to sleep through gunfire literally. During battles, ships didn't stop for bedtime. If your job wasn't on deck, you might lie below with your ears plugged and your hammock swinging to the rhythm of cannon recoil. Boom, sway, boom, sway. Eventually, the body gave up and let sleep in. And then there were the watch rotations. Ships ran on tight schedules. The crew was split into watches, usually 2 or 3 groups who rotated every 4 hours. You worked 4 hours, slept 4 hours, ate in between, and then started again. The sleep was never deep. It couldn't be. You had to wake fast, act fast, tie a knot in the dark, climb a mast in the rain. So even when you were off duty, your brain never really powered down. Some captains enforced nap drills short. Mandatory dozing periods where sailors were expected to lie still, eyes closed, and try to rest. Not because the captain was kind, but because a tired crew was a slow crew. And slow meant dead. In Arctic expeditions, where night could last months, sleep got even weirder. Sailors lost track of time, their internal clocks shattered. Some slept 12 hours, others couldn't sleep at all. Fights broke out, beards froze, hammocks iced over, and still they tried, because sleep, even when terrible, was the only escape. It wasn't just about rest, it was about not being awake, not feeling the hunger, the cold, the fear, not hearing the groan of wood or the crash of waves, just a moment, a single swaying moment where you weren't responsible for keeping the ship afloat. So tonight, if your mattress feels lumpy, or your pillow isn't cold enough, or your upstairs neighbour insists on walking in steel boots, remember this. At least you're not swinging from ropes, with rats for neighbours and the ocean waiting for your slightest misstep. And if your room creaks a little, call it atmospheric. You live in a world that romanticizes sleep, sleep hygiene, sleep trackers, sleep retreats. But just a couple of centuries ago, sleep wasn't a ritual to optimize, it was a problem to survive. Enter the Victorian age. The 19th century was loud, mechanized, full of ambition, coal smoke, and absolutely no sense of when to stop working Sleep in that world was often delayed, drugged, or downright dangerous. Let's begin with the basics. Cities were growing fast, buildings rose like brick mushrooms, factories ran through the night, trains screamed through once silent countrysides, and gas lamps bathed streets in a yellow glow that never quite let the dark return. For the first time in history, you could choose to stay awake long after sunset, and many did, but the body didn't like that. People began reporting a strange condition, urban insomnia. Doctors weren't sure what caused it. Some blamed overstimulation, some blamed indigestion. Others suggested it was the moral decay of the working class. But the result was the same people who once slept in chunks now stared at the ceiling for hours, waiting for sleep that wouldn't come, and so they improvised. Opium was cheap. Laudanum, a tincture of opium mixed with alcohol, was sold over the counter. You could buy it at the chemist next to your cough drops. It was used for toothaches, headaches, heartbreak, hysteria, and most commonly sleep. 1 bottle, 1 spoonful, and the edges of the world began to melt. Mothers gave it to their children. Writers drank it by the ounce. Factory workers took a dose before bed so they wouldn't hear the whistles in their dreams. And it worked, sort of. Opium didn't help you fall asleep, it dropped you into unconsciousness. Your dreams weren't restful. They were vivid, sweaty, full of symbolic nonsense and shadowy figures with Victorian hats. But you didn't care. You weren't awake anymore. Some liked it too much. By mid-century, laudanum addiction was rampant. Poets wrote odes to sleep tinctures. Aristocrats hosted dreaming parties where guests took measured doses, reclined on velvet couches, and sank into synchronized oblivion. It wasn't sleep. It was escapism, bottled and sold by the ounce. But opium wasn't the only tool. The working poor didn't always have money for medicine. They had shifts, long, overlapping shifts. Industrial factories ran around the clock, 12-hour days. Sometimes 16. And when you finally stumbled home, if you had a home, there might be 3 other workers waiting for the same bed. So you rented it by the hour. They called it hotbedding. One person slept while another worked. Then they swapped. No sheets, no privacy, just warmth and whatever sleep your brain could scavenge in 4 hours before the next whistle blew. If you were lucky, the previous tenant didn't snore. Some slept in stairwells, in corners of warehouses, on benches, with arms folded tightly to preserve body heat. A few tried sleeping, standing leaning against walls, hats pulled low, breathing in the soot of their own exhaustion. The wealthy, of course, had different problems. They couldn't sleep either not because of noise, but because of thoughts. Too many books, too many worries, too many nights of lying awake, thinking about empire, etiquette, and whether or not one should redecorate the parlour in French blue. So they turned to professionals. Enter the sleep doctor. Victorian sleep specialists offered treatments ranging from warm milk to electric shocks. Some recommended nightly walks followed by slow breathing and Turkish rugs. Others suggested isolation chambers, rooms padded with silk and silence, where the anxious rich could lie in designer despair until unconsciousness took pity. And then there were bed tents. Yes, bed tents, a fabric canopy designed to block out drafts, light, and most human responsibility. You crawled in, lit a candle, read a page of something depressing, then closed your eyes and hoped you'd wake up without dreams of chimney sweeps or debt collectors. But the sleep didn't always come. Some blamed modernity. Others blamed guilt. Many blamed digestion. Victorian culture was obsessed with digestion. Heavy dinners, consumed by candlelight, followed by sherry, cheese, and intense discussions about parliamentary reform. It wasn't ideal pre-sleep activity. So doctors began prescribing digestive sleep positions. Lie on your right side, not your left. Prop the head at exactly 15 degrees. Don't bend the knees too much. And absolutely, under no circumstances, should you think about your financial obligations while reclining. Still, people struggled, so they bought mechanical beds, devices with springs and levers designed to tilt you into optimal sleep posture. One model vibrated gently like a cat with anxiety to lull you into unconsciousness. Another played music. Badly. And when all else failed, cold water. Some Victorians believed the best way to reset the nervous system was to sleep on cold stone floors, without blankets, without pillows. Let the body remember its fragility. Let the cold shock your system into silence. If you survived the night, you'd earned your rest. Meanwhile, writers and artists romanticized sleeplessness. They called it the nocturnal muse, the idea that inspiration visited only between 2 and 4 a.m. When the world was quiet and your better judgment had gone to bed. They drank coffee, smoked, stared at candle flames, wrote feverishly about love, death, and the cruelty of spring. They didn't sleep, they produced. And so the age of modern insomnia was born not from sleep disorders, but from society's refusal to slow down, to shut up, to dim the lights. Sleep became a negotiation, a transaction, a casualty of progress. So tonight, if your mind won't stop spinning if the blue light glows too bright, or your thoughts start hosting their own dinner party, just know that someone in 1847 also lay awake, wondering if they were doing it wrong. You're not broken. You're just living in a long tradition of humans who forgot that sleep is simple, until they made it complicated. Sleep is usually the absence of action, the pause, the drift. But sometimes sleep has been used to speak to protest, to resist, to transcend, not with words, but with stillness, with shut eyes. With refusal. Some of the strangest sleep in history wasn't about rest at all. It was about making a point. Take, for instance, the fasting sleepers, political prisoners who refused to eat, and eventually refused to stay awake. Hunger strikes are well known today, but in the 1800s, they came with something stranger, sleeping through starvation. Irish rebels in British jails, Indian nationalists under colonial rule, suffragettes chained in cells. Many began their strikes alert, impassioned. But after days without food, speech faded, movement slowed. Eventually, they slept. Not peacefully, not voluntarily, but undeniably, and they stayed asleep. Doctors recorded cases of strikers slipping into semi-comas, described as sleeping as if carved from wax. Visitors wept, guards looked away, governments hesitated, because there was something unbearable about a person who chose to disappear inward rather than submit. These were not naps, these were declarations. Refusing to eat was brave, but refusing to wake that terrified people. And then there were those who claimed their sleep was divine. Throughout the Middle Ages, certain women, almost always women, were known as holy sleepers. They would fall into trances that lasted days, sometimes weeks, no food, no water, no movement, except for the occasional sigh or whisper. They were said to be communing with heaven, their bodies still, their minds elsewhere. Pilgrims came to witness them. Churches allowed them to remain, sometimes placing them near relics or altars. The longer they slept, the more miraculous it seemed. A woman who didn't need bread or conversation or sunlight, just breath and stillness. Skeptics, of course, abounded. Accusations of fraud, accusations of hysteria, accusations of demonic influence. But no one could fully explain the persistence of the trance. Some were tested, needles pressed into skin, eyes forced open, still no response. Others were watched day and night, and yet the sleep remained, as if the act of being seen only made it deeper. In 19th century Europe, this phenomenon took on a medical twist. Doctors classified it as hysterical sleep. They built wards for women who wouldn't wake, not comatose, not brain damaged, just profoundly uninterested in returning. One girl in France slept for 17 days, then rose to eat a single piece of cake before lying back down for another week. Another was said to have slept through her own wedding, only to wake during the toast. Whether these were true trances or elaborate escapes is unclear, but the result was the same sleep as withdrawal, as refusal, as performance, and sometimes as power. Because there is power in not responding, in detaching. In silence, some monks practiced intentional death-sleep meditations mimicking death so perfectly that onlookers began funeral preparations. It wasn't meant to scare, it was meant to practice surrender, to lie so still, so empty, that the self dissolved. In some cases, they never woke up. And in one of the strangest modern echoes of this idea, there were cases in early Soviet psychiatry where dissidents were placed into induced sleep therapy, drugged into unconsciousness for weeks under the claim of resetting the mind. The patients didn't consent, the doctors didn't ask. It was silence, forced from within. But even outside institutions, people have continued to use sleep to say something. Protesters staging sit-ins have sometimes simply fallen asleep in place on concrete steps, inside government buildings, on the floor of banks. Their stillness forced confrontation. They weren't yelling, they weren't breaking things, they were just lying down and not leaving. It unsettled authorities more than shouting ever could. And then there are those who treat sleep as legacy. Inside a chapel in Italy, a 13th century nun lies in glass. She is said to have fallen asleep in prayer and never woken. Her body, remarkably preserved, rests in perpetual slumber. Pilgrims leave notes beside her hands, not because they think she'll reply, but because her sleep has become a message, a reminder that some things are better left unspoken or unwoken. Even in literature, sleep has been used to stretch time. Think of the sleeping kings, buried beneath mountains, waiting to return, or enchanted princesses, dozing for centuries while the world forgets them, the dreamers, the hidden, the ones who choose to wait. Because sometimes choosing not to wake up is the only form of resistance left. And so we arrive at now, you in your room, maybe curled beneath a blanket, maybe half listening, maybe drifting. And this story, full of monks and sailors and grave sleepers and protesters, is just another kind of lullaby. But don't sleep too soundly, because in some corners of history, sleep itself was suspicious. A girl who slept too long, a neighbour who didn't dream the right way, a town that couldn't explain its nightmares. Next, we visit a village in Massachusetts where silence was mistaken for guilt and sleep could be fatal. The Salem Witch. Trials. 92. You wake up to the sound of wind through trees, but it doesn't sound like wind. It sounds like whispering. You can't tell what's being said, only that it's close and not for your ears. The fire has burned out. The room is cold. There's the soft creak of wood-old beams shifting, or maybe footsteps overhead. It's still dark, but you're sure you're not alone. That was life in 1692, not in a haunted house, but in Salem village, where being awake or asleep didn't matter, where your silence might be suspicious, where your dreams might get you hanged. The Salem witch trials didn't begin with proof, they began with restlessness. Something felt wrong. The world was changing, harvests had failed, neighbours were feuding, a war was creeping in from the north, and a new minister had arrived with fire in his sermons. People were uneasy, and when people are uneasy, they start looking for someone to blame. It started in a parsonage, a house built for prayer and quiet. Inside, two girls began behaving strangely. They screamed, they convulsed, they claimed to feel bites on their skin. They said someone was bewitching them. They were 9 and 11 years old, and instead of asking why children might act out in a world full of repression and fear, the village asked who did this to them. The answer came easily, too easily. A Caribbean enslaved woman named Tituba, a beggar named Sarah Good, a sickly woman named Sarah Osborne, 3 people on the edges of society, 3 easy targets. They were arrested, but that wasn't the end. It was barely the beginning, because once you start blaming your discomfort on someone else, you can't stop. More girls joined the afflicted. They moaned and twitched and pointed, and every time they pointed, someone else was accused. Some were people they knew, others were strangers. Some had spoken too boldly, some had stayed too quiet. Some had looked at the wrong person for too long. Some hadn't looked at anyone at all. And suddenly, the line between the waking world and nightmare began to blur. They said witches appeared in dreams, in visions, in the shape of cats, of birds, of shadows at the foot of your bed. They said witches sent their spectres ghostly copies to pinch, choke, or torment, and the courts listened. Imagine that someone claims they saw your invisible warrior bite them, and you're put on trial. The judges wanted evidence, but not the kind you'd expect. They wanted signs, birthmarks, warts, anything that might be a witch's teat from which the devil or a familiar spirit might drink. They wanted confessions, and when they didn't get them, they pressed, literally. One man, Giles Corey, was slowly crushed with stones for refusing to speak. Each time they asked him to confess, he said nothing, just more weight. Others confessed just to stop the pain, or to live. Because those who confessed were often spared. They became useful, they named names. The courts loved names. They turned neighbours into suspects, families into informants, entire communities into a network of fear. At night, people began to whisper before sleeping not prayers, but denials. I am not a witch. I saw nothing. I dreamed nothing. They stuffed cloth into their mouths so they wouldn't talk in their sleep. They avoided eye contact. They skipped gatherings. They burned old dolls. They buried family heirlooms that might be mistaken for charms. Some even stopped dreaming altogether, afraid that what they saw in their sleep might be twisted into evidence. And then it escalated. Children accused their own mothers. Husbands testified against wives. Ministers condemned their congregants. The devil, they said, was clever. He planted his servants among the pure. Anyone could be a witch. Everyone could be, even you. Imagine going to bed in a small wooden house, the door barely latched, the wind creeping in through cracks. You've done nothing wrong. You've fed your chickens. You've mended your clothes. You've kept your head down. But in the morning, someone says they saw your shadow in a dream, and now you're standing in court facing men in powdered wigs, while a teenage girl screams and writhes the moment you speak. How do you defend yourself against something you didn't do? How do you prove you didn't curse a cow or fly over a barn or whisper into the devil's ear? The answer is you don't, because Salem wasn't about guilt. It was about fear. And once fear takes hold, logic dies quickly, the jails filled, the gallows were readied, names piled up, and those who had slept soundly their entire lives suddenly found themselves afraid to close their eyes. They said the devil came to you in sleep, that he offered you a book to sign, that he promised power, safety, comfort, that if you just pressed your name into the page, your suffering would end. They said some signed, and they said others didn't. And those people, the ones who resisted, who stayed silent, who refused to dream the devil's dream, were hanged. So tonight, if you wake from a strange dream, heart racing, unsure where the noise came from, just know that once, that moment might have put you on trial, that in Salem, in 1692, sleep wasn't just a mystery. It was a liability. You want to believe people are reasonable, that if given enough time, enough facts, they'll see through the fog. But in Salem, the fog was thick, and it wasn't made of mist. It was made of fear. The court had a name, the Court of Oyer and Termina. It sounded official, grand, designed to hear and determine, but what it really did was listen to whispers and declare them real. The trials weren't about facts, they were about performances. A girl would enter the room, she'd see the accused and collapse. She'd scream, claim she was being pinched, that a black shape was hovering, that the old woman across from her was flying right now above the heads of the jury, and the court would nod. Spectral evidence. They called it testimony about dreams, visions, or things only one person could see, no proof required, just emotion. Just terror. You didn't need to commit a crime. You just needed to be feared. And in a town like Salem, fear spread like fire. It moved from one house to the next, from one family to another. Suspicion fed on small things, a strange birthmark, a muttered comment, a bad harvest, a child who fell ill. Neighbours became nervous. The widow who lived alone, suspicious. The midwife whose patients died in childbirth, dangerous. The woman who sold herbs for sleep, tempting fate. Soon, anyone who didn't blend in became a target. The court demanded more names, more confessions, more bodies. The jails overflowed, chains rattled. People began to ask, quietly, when it would stop, but it didn't. Even violence became a threat. If you refused to speak like Giles Corey, you were punished, not just with death, but with humiliation. He was laid flat, a board placed over his chest, heavy stones stacked one by one until his ribs broke. He said nothing, just more weight. That was his resistance, his only defence in a world that no longer cared for truth. Meanwhile, the ones who confessed were spared the noose, because confession was cooperation. It made the machine run, and so people lied to survive. They invented sins they hadn't committed, named others who were just as innocent. The courts rewarded them, the community looked away, and deep down, everyone knew it was wrong. But the trials gave people something powerful, a sense of control. When life was hard, when crops failed, when illness spread, when enemies loomed, it felt better to blame someone, to say, this didn't just happen, someone caused it. It's easier to hang a neighbour than face the chaos of the world. So the town played along, even children testified. Even ministers gave sermons in favour of executions. The air turned heavy with certainty that evil had names, faces, neighbours, and then something shifted. Because fear doesn't stay small. One day, the accusers pointed their fingers higher at a minister's wife, at a wealthy merchant, at someone with real influence, and suddenly the court hesitated. If witches could be anyone, then anyone could be next, even those in the powdered wigs, even those who gave the orders. The governor's own wife was whispered about. That was enough. The court was shut down, trial stopped, execution ceased. But the damage had already been done. 19 people hanged, 1 crushed, dozens more broken, children orphaned, homes destroyed, reputation shattered, and a village that would never quite sleep the same again afterward. Some apologised. Judges admitted they'd been wrong. Jurors begged forgiveness. A day of fasting was declared not to celebrate, but to mourn, to grieve what had been lost, what had been believed. But you can't unring a bell. The dead stayed dead. The accusation stayed on paper. The fear, once released, never fully went away. And Salem became a cautionary tale, a story people tell to remind themselves how quickly reason can rot, how easy it is to mistake panic for truth, how dangerous it is to let nightmares dictate justice. But maybe it's not just about Salem. Maybe it's about every time you looked at someone and thought not like me, every time someone stood out too quiet, too loud, too strange, too still, and you wondered if they were hiding something, because deep down, you don't want to believe the world is random. You want to believe there's a pattern, that misfortune has a face, that the things that scare you have a source. That way, you can point and accuse and maybe sleep better at night. Salem didn't happen because people were evil. It happened because people were afraid and tired and so very certain they were right. So tonight, when your thoughts won't settle and your mind plays tricks in the dark, remember this. There was once a town where certainty killed and silence was never safe. You hear your name, not shouted, not whispered, just spoken by someone across the room, in a voice that doesn't rise, that simply says it as if it were true. And now you're accused, not because you did anything, but because someone said you did. And that's enough. That's how it happened for Rebecca Nurse, a grandmother, a respected woman, known for her piety, for her calm presence, for her hands that had delivered babies and tended fevers. When she was accused, the town gasped. Surely not her, but the court didn't gasp. The court listened. The afflicted girls wailed on cue. They clutched their throats. They cried out her name. And the judges leaned forward. Rebecca denied everything. She quoted scripture. She prayed. She stood calmed as girls convulsed around her. But silence wasn't enough. She was found guilty, then briefly pardoned, then sentenced again. Her walk to the gallows was slow, not because of fear, but because she couldn't quite believe it, and neither could many others, but belief had lost its value. Emotion ruled, and the world, for a little while, was upside down. There was John Proctor, too, a farmer, blunt, not easily intimidated. When his wife was accused, he spoke out, called the trials madness, dared the court to stop. So they accused him next. He was no saint. He had enemies, a sharp tongue. But even his flaws couldn't explain what happened. He was tried, condemned, and hanged before he died. He refused to confess, because a false confession, he said, would be a worse death. Others confessed not because they believed it, but because they wanted to live. Can you blame them? The air in the jails was thick with sickness. The food was mould, the floor dirt, women gave birth in chains, children cried through the bars, the lucky ones were forgotten, but the unlucky, they were remembered just long enough to be judged. Some were 5 years old, and some were in their 80s. If you were a baby and born to an accused woman, you were a suspect. If you cried at the wrong moment, if you laughed at the wrong word, if you stood near a cow that died unexpectedly, you became evidence. The community fractured. Old feuds reignited. Property was seized. Confessions were traded for safety. People learned not to speak, not to visit, not to be seen at the wrong house at the wrong time. And yet, every night, the wind still blew, the trees still creaked, the houses still shifted, but now the fear came from inside. Because what if you believed someone was guilty, and they weren't? What if you named a name just to protect your own? Some did it casually, some regretted it, some never admitted anything at all, even years later. Long after the trials ended, the shame lingered, a silence settled over Salem. Thicker than the snow in winter, people didn't talk about what happened, not openly, not often, but the names were still known, the graves still marked, the houses still stood, and the town remembered. They tried to make amends. In 1706, Anne Putnam, one of the original accusers, just a child during the trials, stood in front of her congregation and apologized. She said the devil had deceived her, that she hadn't meant to harm, that she'd been wrong. She was 26, older, different, but not absolved. The name she spoke had still died, and her words, though heavy, couldn't bring them back. Others followed. Apologies were written, compensation offered. The government admitted its error eventually, but none of it felt quite real, because once you kill someone for something they didn't do, you can't fix it, not with money, not with guilt, not even with time. What was left was a story, a caution, a slow-burning ache in the pages of history, and a village that would forever be associated with hysteria. But it wasn't just hysteria. Caught a theology, a culture of control, of inherited fear. It was a mirror, held up to every society that thinks it's above superstition, every era that claims it would never do something so absurd, because Salem didn't invent paranoia, just gave it names, procedures, a scaffold, gave fear a voice, and justice a blindfold that looked more like a hood. So tonight, as you lie still, listening to the noises your house makes, the ones you usually ignore, consider how quickly a whisper becomes a charge, how softly a lie can land, how easily it finds purchase when people are cold, tired, and too afraid to question, and how hard it is to undo a noose once it's tied. Long after the trials ended, the town remained quiet, too quiet. There were no more accusations, no more cries in the courtroom, no more gallows, but there were absences, chairs left empty at mealtime, houses boarded shut, paths no longer walked, names people avoided speaking, not because they were afraid, but because they were ashamed. Salem did not erase what happened, but it did what many communities do when the unthinkable becomes memory. It softened the details. They said the girls were confused, that the ministers were misled, that the judges were caught in something bigger than themselves, that the devil, as always, had a hand in it, and so blame was scattered, like ashes in the wind. You could feel it in the way people lowered their voices, in how fast they changed the subject, in the way certain doors were never knocked on again. History calls it a witch hunt, but in Salem, it wasn't just the witches who were lost, it was certainty, trust, the belief that your neighbour wouldn't hurt you, the belief that if you lived a quiet, good life, you'd be left alone. Those things died, too. Years passed, children grew up, the trees grew taller, but the story lingered. People told it with caution, not because it was strange, but because it was familiar, because fear is not rare, suspicion is not rare, and in the wrong season, in the wrong weather, they bloom quickly. There were efforts to heal in the 20th century. Salem finally erected memorials, quiet stones with quiet names, dates, locations, a gentle curve of granite that lists the dead, not the accused, but the victims. They didn't add commentary, they let the silence speak. You can visit, if you like. The memorial is tucked behind the old cemetery. There's grass, some shade, a few benches, no admission fee, no candles, just a space to remember what happens when justice forgets itself. Tourists come for the legends. The shops sell broomsticks and charms. There are haunted houses, theatrical reenactments of plastic cauldrons. But if you stand still long enough, just outside the noise, you'll feel it, the weight of it, not the thrill, not the myth, the grief, because Salem wasn't magic, it wasn't cursed. It was just a place full of people, some kind, some cruel, some afraid, some too tired to resist, just like any place. And maybe that's the real reason the story survives, not because it's about witches, but because it's about us, our ability to believe what's easiest, our hunger for simple answers, our tendency to look away until it's too late, to silence dissent, to reward fear, but also our ability to learn, to apologize, to build monuments not for triumph, but for humility. That is rare. So tonight, if you find yourself lying awake, unsure whether the creak in your wall is just wood or wind or something you forgot to fix, just know the people of Salem once heard the same sounds, and for a time they thought the devil had come. But maybe it was just the cold, maybe it was just the dark, or maybe it was the echo of everything they wished they hadn't done still walking through the halls, still tapping gently at the edge of sleep. The Life of Fulvia. You wake up in a marble villa, not yours, of course your family's. You were born into money, the kind of money that doesn't ask where the marble came from, or who mixed the wine, or which slave is quietly sweeping the mosaic tiles outside your bedroom. You are Fulvia, Roman aristocracy, descended from conquerors and senators, raised with tutors, musicians, and the quiet expectation that you will marry well, speak little, and remain politically invisible. You have other plans, but no one knows that yet. The Roman Republic, what's left of it, is loud. Men shout in the forum, coins are thrown, graffiti appears overnight, senators are stabbed in daylight. There are trials and riots and triumphs. But mostly there is talk, endless talk about power, betrayal, and which general is currently most terrifying. This is the world you inherit, and into it steps your first husband, Publius Clodius Pulcher, a man whose name translates roughly to pretty boy Clodius, though no one dares say it to his face. He's charming, radical, loud. He promises land to the poor, grain to the masses, and vengeance to his enemies. You marry him young. It's a political match, but also theatrical. He brings you roses and revolutions. You share not just a bed, but a cause. He makes enemies quickly, powerful ones, and you watch carefully as your name begins to appear in conversations that should only involve men. They say Clodius is dangerous, reckless, disrespectful of tradition. You smile, that's why you married him. But Rome is not kind to reckless men. One afternoon, he's ambushed on the Appian Way. It's not a duel, it's an execution. His enemies do not miss. He is stabbed, bleeds in the dust, dragged into a tavern and left for dead. His body is retrieved by his followers and brought to the forum, laid on a pyre made of courtroom benches, set aflame. His funeral becomes a riot. And you do not cry in public. You do not retreat. Instead, you hold his memory like a weapon. You speak, you plot, you step forward. When you are expected to disappear into mourning, the city watches. A woman should not be political. A widow should be quiet, but you are neither. You arrange his funeral, you direct the mobs, you give speeches not from the rostrum, but from rooftops, balconies, street corners. You call for vengeance, for justice, for names. And people listen. They say Fulvia is dangerous, that she is not grieving properly, that she is using her husband's death for influence. Again, you smile, because they're right. You remarry quickly, by Roman standards. Your second husband, Gaius Scribonius Curio, another firebrand, another tribune of the plebs, another man with dangerous allies and more dangerous opinions. You like his voice, his confidence, the way he speaks Caesar's name like an invitation and a threat. You like that when he argues in the forum. The crowd leans in, not out. You like that he doesn't mind being married to Fulvia. But Curio, like Clodius, doesn't last long. He dies in North Africa, fighting for Caesar, cut down before he can make a real name for himself. You are widowed again. This time, there's no riot, no pyre, just silence, and war on the horizon. The Republic is dying. You can feel it. The air is full of speeches and ash. Caesar has crossed the Rubicon. Pompey is fleeing. The Senate is splintered. And yet in this chaos, your name still circulates. Whispers, warnings. People say Fulvia marries like a general chooses allies. They don't know the half of it, because husband number 3 is not just a senator or a speaker. He's Mark Antony. You've heard of him. Of course, everyone has. A soldier, a drinker, Caesar's favourite. The man who partied through every campaign and somehow survived. When he enters a room, it gets louder and warmer and more dangerous. You marry him, not out of desperation, not for protection. You marry him because you understand him. He wants power. You do too. He wants Rome, and you've already lived long enough to know what it costs together. You are the most talked about couple in the city. You fight Caesar's wars. You guard his interests back home. And when Caesar dies stabbed 23 times on the Senate floor, you do not mourn. You calculate, because now Antony rises, and with him, so do you. You are no longer just a wife, you are a player, and Rome, still burning at the edges, begins to wonder. What happens when a woman refuses to grieve quietly? The knives go into Caesar, but the blade twists through Rome. When news of the assassination spreads, people don't cry. They freeze, because no one knows what comes next. The man who held it all together is gone, and now everyone wants a peace. Mark Antony steps forward. He doesn't mourn long. He speaks at Caesar's funeral. He reads the will. He lifts the bloody toga for all to see. You, Fulvia, are there, watching. 'Tis not grief you feel, 'tis momentum. Antony aligns himself with Caesar's memory, and you help. You remind people of your past, the husband who died for the people, the speeches, the loyalty. You're not starting from zero. You never were. But something unexpected happens. A teenager arrives, Caesar's adopted son, barely 20, soft-faced, unimpressive at first glance. His name is Octavian. You don't like him. He's calculating, cold. He speaks with the softness of someone who already knows he's going to win. And worst of all, the people like him. They see Caesar in his jawline, in his promises. They see a future. Antony sees a threat. You see a chessboard. Rome fractures again. Factions form. Legions shift loyalty like weather. Streets fill with rumours. Blood runs in alleys, not just battlefields. Antony makes his move politically, publicly, and occasionally drunkenly. You steady him. You write letters, call in favours, pay soldiers, host gatherings that aren't quite conspiracies. You remind everyone who Fulvia is. You're not the wife behind the scenes, you're in the scenes. And when Antony forms the second triumvirate with Octavian and Lepidus, you nod. Knowing it will not last, power, when split in threes, never stays balanced. Then comes the list, the prescriptions, hundreds of names marked for death, enemies of the new regime, rich men, rivals, philosophers, even friends, anyone with land worth seizing or opinions worth silencing. It is horrifying, efficient, and very Roman. You do not protest, not because you agree, but because you understand the game. Antony departs east to secure his power. Octavian stays in Italy to build his... And you stay in Rome, but you are not still. You become a power centre. Soldiers still loyal to Antony come to you for orders. You meet with senators, with generals, with clients, with wives. You speak in coded phrases, host quiet dinners, make loud appearances. Some say Fulvia has overstepped, that she acts like a man. You correct them, you act like a Roman, you raise funds, recruit soldiers, write letters that read like declarations. And when Octavian begins seizing lands from veterans breaking promises, Antony made you act. Because your husband may be gone, but you are still here. You align with Lucius Antonius, Antony's brother. Together, you organize resistance, not just in words and troops. You march. This isn't metaphorical. You don armor, ride with the army, lead them north, not as a figurehead, as a commander. Octavian calls it rebellion. You call it a reminder that Rome does not belong to boys who inherit names, that loyalty still means something, that Fulvia Pulchra Bambolina daughter, wife, widow, mother does not vanish into a villa when told to. You set up camp in Perusia, a fortified city. You wait for Antony to return, for support, for something. But winter arrives first, supplies run low, the siege tightens, morale cracks, the dream of a counter-movement thins like frost on the stones. Octavian surrounds the city, and you, Fulvia, stand at the centre of it all, not hiding, not weeping, just enduring. Eventually, you surrender. Lucius begs for mercy. Octavian gives it, because killing your rival's brother is messy. Killing his wife, however, is something else, so he lets you leave, but not with your army, not with your dignity intact. He lets you drift to Greece, to obscurity, to a version of exile that looks like retreat. Antony does not come to meet you. He is busy, eastward, entangled with Cleopatra, writing his own history with his own queen. You get the message, and though no letter says it, you know your part in the story has ended. Greece is quiet. There are no crowds here, no tribunals, no graffiti scrawled in the night. Just warm winds off the sea, and dust that settles evenly on marble and memory. You, Fulvia, once stirred riots in the forum, now you sit on a shaded terrace, staring at waves that don't care who you used to be. They call it exile, but it's quieter than that. Antony has stopped writing. There was a time when his messengers came weekly, full of plans, complaints, reassurance, but now nothing. The silence grows longer. You know what it means before it's spoken aloud. He is with Cleopatra. You've never met her, but you know her type, not a shadow of a man, like so many wives in Rome, not a decoration, not a retreat, a woman who rules, who plans, who commands with softness and steel. You almost admire her. Almost. But admiration does not mend betrayal. Your marriage is functionally over, politically inconvenient, emotionally disposable. What began as a partnership ends as a paragraph in someone else's scroll. There is no scandal, no trial, just the fading. History doesn't record your final months in detail. No monologue, no descent into madness, no triumphant return, just a note: Fulvia died in 40 BC, in Greece. Some say from illness, some say from grief. The truth doesn't matter to them, it matters to you. You do not die weeping. You do not write desperate letters. You do not beg. You slip out of the story the way many powerful women do through the side door of memory. Rome moves on quickly. Octavian seizes more land. Antony sends messages from Alexandria. The Republic tightens into something colder, quieter, imperial. Your name lingers, briefly. Octavian blames you for starting the civil war. He tells people Antony's mistakes began with Fulvia, that you goaded him, manipulated him, dragged him into bloodshed. You don't get to defend yourself. You're gone before the rebuttal. And that's how it happens. Not with one death, but with a series of erasures, statues removed. deeds reassigned, stories retold by men who didn't like being challenged, who didn't like the idea that a woman might lead, fight, defy and survive. They turned you into a warning, a caricature, a cautionary tale about ambition with earrings, about women who don't know their place, but some remembered you differently. Your allies, your clients, and your friends, the ones who still whispered your name in markets and doorways. They remembered you in stories that didn't get carved into marble, but into breath, into retellings. They remembered your voice, sharp and clear, your presence, upright when others collapsed, the way you took command when command was needed, not allowed, the way you buried 2 husbands, raised children, led armies, and still found time to be feared. And tonight, they might not remember your full name, or your birth year, or the names of the 3 men you married, outlived, or outmaneuvered. But somewhere, in some old part of Rome, someone still walks past a corner where you once stood and feels it. Not haunting, just memory. Because Fulvia was never quiet, and never meant to be. You slept when it suited you. You woke when it didn't, and in a city full of men who thought they controlled history. You wrote your lines in ink too dark to fade, so if the world forgets, let it, because forgetting you never made you smaller. It just made them easier to ignore. The March on Washington, 1963. You've been told not to go. It's too far, too risky, too hot, too many people, too much police, too much hope. They say and hope in the wrong place gets you hurt, but you pack your bag anyway, not because you think it'll change the world, not because someone promised you justice, but because not going feels worse. It's the summer of 1963. The air is thick, not just with heat, but with tension. You've heard the news, the church bombings, the dogs in Birmingham, the beatings, the arrests. You've seen the photos of fire hoses, the broken windows, the eyes that no longer look surprised, and still they march. So when someone passes you a flyer small, black letters on off-white paper, you don't throw it away. You read it twice. The March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, Wednesday, August 28th, Lincoln Memorial, 12 noon. You don't know who wrote the flyer, but you know what it means. You've heard of the organisers' big names, some on TV, some in church, some with FBI files thicker than your phone book, but the people going, most of them, look like you. Teachers, maids, carpenters, retired steelworkers, choir members, teenagers with sunburnt shoulders. They gather in church basements and around kitchen tables. Some whisper, some sing, some argue over what shoes to wear, some ask if they'll be safe. There are no promises. The buses are arranged through back channels, unions, churches, community centres. Sometimes you pay, sometimes someone else covers it, sometimes no one pays, and the driver goes anyway. You're told to bring water, wear light clothes, be respectful, don't provoke, sing if you can, pray if you believe, and, above all, keep walking. You board the bus before dawn, the seats are stiff, the windows fog with breath, the air smells like coffee, sleep, and something older fear. Maybe. No one talks much at first. Some have never left their town, some have never been to D.C., some don't know what the White House looks like, except in photos, but they go because something pulls them forward. Some ride trains, some fly not many, but a few. Others drive in worn-down Chevys with quiet engines. They bring children, or leave them behind. They carry signs rolled in newspaper, sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, extra socks. You ride through towns that pretend not to see you, gas stations that won't serve you, restrooms with signs that still whisper the old rules, the ones everyone claims are being dismantled. You keep going, because this is a march. Yes, but it's also a moment, a gathering, a chance to look around and realise you are not alone. As you draw closer to the capital, more buses appear on the road, from the Carolinas, from Ohio, from Louisiana and Brooklyn and Chicago. You see heads turn at intersections, some wave, some stare. And then, finally, the skyline low, white monuments rising like bones from the earth. You arrive. Washington, D.C. feels like a city holding its breath. There are more police than usual, more cameras, more people in suits, pretending not to be nervous. But there's also music, soft, slow, drifting from the mole like someone left the radio on. You disembark, legs stiff, a mouth dry, shirt sticking to your back, and you begin to walk, not fast, not with fists raised, just with intention, quietly and together. You are one body in a crowd of tens of thousands. Some say 100,000, others say 200,000. No one really knows because the numbers keep growing. You see faces of every shade. You hear accents you don't recognize. You see rabbis, nuns, college kids, war veterans, sanitation workers, Black Panthers in press jackets, white women in summer dresses balancing babies on their hips. Everyone looks awake, not angry, not afraid, just alert. Like they have all decided that something needs to be witnessed, and they've come to be the witnesses. The city doesn't fall apart. There are no riots, no fires, no chaos, just heat and walking, and a low hum of voices rising into a sound like wind between buildings. You find a spot near the reflecting pool. It's already crowded, but no one pushes. Some stand, some sit, some stretch out on the grass. You spot someone dozing off in the sun, hat pulled over their face, a sign resting on their chest. We march for those who can't. There's no stage in sight yet, no speeches, just the build-up, the moment before the moment, and in that pause, you feel something shift. It's not electric, not dramatic, just real. You feel the weight of feet on earth, the echo of people who've waited too long, the ache in your back, and the quiet relief that, for now, you're among people who get it. No slogans needed, no chants, just presence, just proof that someone came. The sun climbs higher, you shift on the grass, your back aches, your feet tingle, a bead of sweat traces your spine. Someone nearby passes a damp rag from hand to hand, pressing it to the back of the neck like a shared blessing. People have been arriving for hours. The grass is no longer visible, just hats, signs, bare shoulders. Every direction you turn, there is someone else, standing, waiting, breathing. The microphones crackle, the air pops. A man tests the sound, says a word no one catches, then fades back into silence. And then a voice. It isn't a speech, not yet. It's music, soft at first, then stronger. You know the song, everyone does. Mahalia Jackson's voice rises like warm smoke, not loud, not demanding, just anchored. A hymn wrapped in soul. It cuts through the humidity like it's made of something heavier than sound. You don't know whether to close your eyes or hold your breath. People around you start to hum. Some sing, some just stand very still. She doesn't perform. She prays, and when the music ends, the silence feels like part of it, not an absence, but a held note. Then the speeches begin, not shouting, not anger, just voices. One by one they rise, each with their rhythm, their moment, their version of the dream. You don't remember every name, not every word, but the cadence stays with you. The way they speak to the crowd, not over it. The way they build their arguments, not with fire, but with facts. Bayard Rustin, A. Philip Randolph, Walter Reuther, Rabbi Joachim Prince. They don't speak for themselves. They speak for factories that don't hire, schools that don't teach, neighbourhoods carved by red lines and emptied by promises. They speak for jobs, for dignity, for children not yet born, for those already buried. And all the while, the crowd doesn't chant. It listens. There are signs. Yes, cloth stretched over wood, held high, messages inked by hand the night before. Some are simple. We demand equal rights. Jobs for all. End segregation now. Some are just names. One man holds a cardboard square that says, "For Emmett." That's all. No date. No last name. No explanation needed. The heat presses down. People pass canteens. Paper fans. Someone shares peanuts. Someone else reads quietly from a worn Bible. Time softens. Hours pass without counting. You don't look at your watch and you look at faces. Old men with canes. Women in pressed Sunday dresses. teenagers with t-shirts and untied laces, a baby sleeping in a basket, a woman with her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles are white, and through it all, you wait for the voice everyone came for. He stands, finally, near the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. No fanfare, no drum roll, just a man in a suit, with a paper in his hands and a future in his throat. Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. He begins with notes. You can hear it, the careful words, the written ones, measured and calm, but the crowd leans forward. Someone, maybe Mahalia, maybe the wind, says, "Tell them about the dream," and something changes. He looks up from the page, and the next words are not read, they're released. You've heard them before, maybe in church, maybe on a radio, but not like this. I have a dream. It isn't just a sentence, it's a rhythm, a heartbeat. He speaks of children holding hands, of justice rolling down like water, of mountains lowered and valleys lifted, of a table where all can sit. You don't cheer, you don't cry, you absorb. The voice is clear, measured, heavy. It moves through you like memory arriving before experience, like something you'll remember, even if you forget everything else. And when it ends, there's a pause, no music, no announcement, just silence, deep and respectful. Silence full of things too big to say aloud. You look around, no one wants to be the first to move. Eventually, someone claps, others join, but softly, as if not to break the spell. Then people begin to shift, stretch, gather bags, fold signs, not because they are finished, but because the moment is. There's no grand finale, no fireworks, no victory lap, just steps. You walk back to the bus, to the car, the train station. The city exhales, and so do you. Because you know this wasn't the end of anything. It was a signal that people showed up, that they spoke, that they were seen. You don't know what laws will pass, what promises will be kept. You don't know who will live long enough to see the dream unfold, but you were there, you heard it, and that for now is enough. The next morning, life resumes. The headlines print the numbers 200,000 marchers, more or less. The speeches are quoted, clipped into phrases. The photo of Dr. King at the podium is everywhere, arms outstretched, mouth open, the stone of Lincoln behind him, like a witness carved in silence. You're not in the photo. Most people aren't. But you remember how it felt to stand there, to wait, to listen, to breathe among strangers who, for a few hours, felt like a family. When you go back to work, you hang the sign you carried behind a closet door. You tell a neighbour about the heat. You tell your child that you saw something important. You don't explain what, you just say it was important. Others say the same. In churches, in beauty salons, in cafeterias, in buses, people talk. Carefully, as if afraid they'll lose it by speaking too soon. The feeling doesn't go. Because what you saw wasn't a march. It wasn't a protest. It wasn't a rally with a program and a schedule. It was a breath, a pause in the noise of history, a moment where people stood still together, long enough to say, "We're here, not perfect, not finished, but present," and that matters. There are still laws to pass, still battles ahead, still violence, setbacks, betrayals, delays, but also still footsteps, still signs, still music in the distance, and sometimes, even now, on quiet nights. You remember the sound of Mahalia's voice, the heat of the marble steps, the way everyone stopped when the dream was spoken aloud. And you wonder if dreaming, in that moment, wasn't just metaphor. Maybe it was literal. Maybe, for a few minutes with the breeze moving through the crowd and the weight of hope held carefully in 1,000 hands, people were suspended in something soft, something just short of sleep. Not because they were tired, but because dreaming is the mind's way of saying what the world won't allow. You remember what it felt like, not the speech, not the signs, the quiet, the moment between applause, the space between words, the way strangers looked at each other and didn't look away. You remember your feet on the grass, the stillness, the way nothing burned, broke, or shattered, the way change didn't arrive with thunder, but with shoes worn thin, by distance. That's how things shift. Not in noise, but in the moment after, where people go home, rest, wake up, and carry something invisible with them. A phrase, a posture, a memory tucked behind the ribs, like a map you don't need to unfold to follow. You still walk, you still hope, you still wake, and when the world turns loud again, as it always does, you'll have that one afternoon, in the heat, in the crowd, with voices rising like prayer and falling like breath, a dream, spoken aloud, and heard, even now, in the dark. Maybe you hear it again, not the words, just the rhythm, the sound of a voice rising slowly, calmly, clearly, telling you not to give up, telling you to rest, telling you that someone, somewhere, still dreams. So tonight you can close your eyes and know that it wasn't just history, it was a moment, and it was yours.